Chapter 4 Administrative System under 1935 Act. In the previous unit, we have covered administrative developments during the period from the War of Independence 1857 to the Montagu-Chelmsford Reform 1919. The general observation was that the policy of the British government to associate people with the system of government seemed to be more apparent than real and therefore failed. In this unit, we will discuss developments that led to the Government of India Act 1935 and its main provisions affecting the structure of government and administrative arrangements. We will also locate the reasons for the failure of the Act of 1935 and highlight the events inevitably leading to the new constitutional exercise for free India. Prelude to the reforms. The Simon Commission 1927. The 1919 Act had provided for the appointment of a commission to review the provisions of the Act in the light of its working and to extend, modify or restrict the degree of responsibility of Government of India. The commission was to be appointed in 1929 as per the provisions of the Act, but for various political reasons it was appointed in 1927 with Sir John Simon as its chairman. The all-European composition of the commission was taken as an insult to Indian nationalism. The Indian National Congress therefore decided to boycott the commission at every stage and in every form. The slogan "Simon Go Back" had an electrifying effect. There was also a revival of terrorist activity, reflecting the anger of the people due to the manner in which the national leaders like Lal Lajpat Rai were treated by the police. The commission, however, completed its work. The recommendations of the report were further examined by the Joint Select Committee of the Parliament. The Simon Report recommended the discontinuation of the diarchy and leave provincial government in the hands of ministers responsible to provincial legislature. Some safeguards, however, were retained in the interests of minorities in the grant of special powers to the governor. It recommended a federation-like structure at the center, a Council of Greater India representing both the interests, the British India and the princely states. Political atmosphere in India was hostile to acceptance of the report. Otherwise, some of the recommendations of the Simon Commission would have hastened the process of fully responsible government in the provinces as well as at the center. The Nehru Scheme. The Nehru Scheme. Boycotting the Simon Commission was a negative way of response. The challenge was to frame a proposal of constitutional reform acceptable to all. An all-party conference was therefore called at Delhi in February 1928, and it came out with a report within 6 months, August 1928, known as the Nehru Report. It was named after Pandit Motilal Nehru, the chairman of the committee which was constituted to draft the recommendations. The Indian National Congress ratified the Nehru Report in its Calcutta session held in December 1928. The report recommended responsible governments both at the provinces and the center. The central government had bicameral legislature. Its lower house, the House of Representatives, was directly elected from joint non-communal constituencies. The distribution of power was on federal basis with residual power retained with the center. It recommended setting up a defense committee with advisory functions. It also provided fundamental rights in the constitution, the status of Northwest Frontier Province so as to help Muslims having majority in 4 provinces. It recommended princely states to hasten the introduction of similar changes. Response. Though Congress accepted the Nehru Report, Muslims rejected it. Under Jinnah's 14 points 1929, they favored residuary powers to the provinces, one-third representation to the Muslims in central legislature and ministers, concurrence of 3/4 members of a community before a bill affecting its interest is passed, protection of Muslim culture and due representation in governmental services. Congress also was not happy with the goal of dominion status as recommended by the Nehru report. Obviously, the report had favored dominion status not as an ultimate goal, but the next immediate step in constitutional reforms. The Simon Commission's recommendations were discussed in three round-table conferences 1930, 1931 and 1932. The first round-table had the background of Gandhi's civil disobedience movement. The second met when sympathetic Labour Party was voted out of power in Britain. The third worked in the shadow of the Communal Award of MacDonald, August 1932, which accorded separate electorates on communal basis, thereby perpetuating communal tensions and encouraging separatist tendencies. The Pune Pact, September 1932, between Mahatma Gandhi and B.R. Ambedkar, modified the provisions of the communal award and respect to the depressed classes. Ambedkar agreed to joint electorates and in exchange got more representation. The third round table finalized the subcommittee recommendations. The three conferences collectively shaped the most important constitutional reforms in the Indian history. The Government of India Act 1935. The Government of India Act 1935 main features. The White Paper and the Joint Select Committee report shaping the Government of India Act 1935 dropped and altered many suggestions of the Simon Commission and the recommendations of the Round Table conferences. This confirms that British nation has no intention whatsoever of relinquishing effective control of Indian life and progress. The Act retained the supremacy of the British Parliament and also the preamble of the Act of 1919. It meant gradual realization of self-governing institutions as the goal, and there was no mention of dominion status and the inclusion of provisions to attain it. All rights of amending, altering or repealing the provisions were kept with the British Parliament. The Act removed diarchy of the provincial level but introduced it at the central level. It also introduced safeguards operated in the interest of the British for the first time. The wide range of subjects were classified in the three-list system and assigned to appropriate level of government. This was a novel experiment. Comments. Looking at the provisions of the Government of India Act 1935, it appears that the Joint Select Committee moved away from some of the recommendations of the Round Table conferences and the White Paper. For example, introduction of indirect system of election for the Federal Council or the restrictions on the powers of federal courts to preserve the supremacy of the Privy Council. The nature of safeguards, residuary powers with the Governor General, composition of the federal legislature make it clear that the Act provided a federal form but lacked federal spirit. All India administrative system at the center, All India Federation. The Act proposed a federation of British provinces and princely states in India. The princely states had an option to join the federation, and the nature of a relationship would differ from state to state according to the instrument of accession. But the instrument of accession, once extended, would be irrevocable. The Act provided a bicameral legislature, the lower house elected directly and the upper house with a composite representation to princely states and affluent classes. The Act also gave more powers to the upper house, the Council of States, that of voting grants and making ministers responsible to the Council too. The subjects allotted to the federal provincial governments were detailed in the three-list system. Muslim representatives wanted the United States of America model with strong provincial governments. The liberals favored the Canadian model with a strong center by keeping with it the residuary powers. At the round tables, Lord Sankey, the chairman of the Federal Structure Committee, therefore suggested the model of three-list system, detailing powers for both the center and the provincial governments, and doing it exhaustively so as to leave very little powers in the residuary area. The subjects of common interest for the whole country and which demanded a uniform treatment were covered by the federal list. These included 59 items. Subjects primarily of provincial interests and where no uniform treatment was necessary were put in the provincial list. This contained 54 items. A third list covered subjects primarily of provincial interests where uniform action was or would be desirable. These numbered 36. Residuary powers to accommodate future needs were vested in the hands of the Governor General. The Act provided a federal court to interpret the provisions and to decide over inter-province disputes. The principle of diarchy, that is, dividing governmental administration into reserved and transferred subjects and treating them differently, was introduced at the center. The Act thus proposed a federal form of government for India and for the rest time tried to bring British provinces and Indian states under one common constitution. It carried the essential features of federation, a written constitution, division of subjects between federal and provincial governments, and thirdly, a federal court to interpret the provisions of the constitution. The Act not only pointed out the direction of our constitutional development, but also greatly influenced our constitution making an independent India. Failure of the All India Federation. The proposed All India Federation did not materialize. It was conceptually inadequate and structurally defective. It could convince nobody, the Indian National Congress, the Muslim League, the Hindu Mahasabha or the princely states. Muslims opposed the majority rule. Princes opposed the forces of democracy and Congress opposed federation by courtesy. It thus remained a lost of ideal. Federation is a political mechanism. The members entering into a union should be independent, legally equal and should voluntarily from the union. Here the princely states had an option to join the federation and also to decide their relations with the federal government through the provisions of the instrument of accession. Also, undue weightage was given to the princely states. They could send their nominees and not elect representatives like British provinces, and the representation was proportionally larger than their geographic or demographic strength. With roughly one-fourth of the population of British India, the princely states had 104 seats out of 260 in the Council of State and 125 out of 375 in the House of Assembly. This created a reactionary bloc in the legislature as the princely states were lagging behind the provinces in the introduction and practice of democratic reforms. In a federation, constitution is supreme, but in the Act, supremacy of the British Parliament was retained. The Secretary of State for India and the Governor General were the ultimate authority and they were above the Act. The Act gave area of discretion, area of individual judgment and special responsibility to the Governor General. This made the Governor General not responsible to the legislature. As the diarchy was introduced at the center, his control over reserved subjects was absolute and over transferred subjects very effective. All the governors and ICS officers acted under his instructions. Federal Constitution, on the other hand, tries for a balance in power in its different organs and levels. Provincial autonomy was also restricted in practice in the context of safeguards provided in the Act. Such provincial governments with an unrepresentative and powerless central legislature made negation of the spirit of federalism. Though the distribution of power through the three list system could be condemned as being the first attempt and could have been improved upon, keeping residuary powers with the Governor General was harmful. The Act could have developed some healthy conventions and certain powers given to executive being accepted as natural if the executive would have been responsible to the legislature and the legislature supreme in its field. Both these aspects were missing, utterly called therefore the keynote of Act as mistrust and distrust. The line of thinking now changed, and Congress felt that the struggle for self-government would not further be carried within a constitutional frame, but need to be carried on a mass base. This indicated the full decline of the liberals and the endorsement of Mahatma Gandhi's mass agitational movements. The logic of quit India thus becomes clear. Provincial autonomy, legislature and executive at the provinces. The 1935 Act discontinued the application of diarchy, introduced at the provincial level under the Act of 1919, as the experiment failed miserably. The distinction between transferred and reserved subjects were removed, and the whole administration was entrusted with the ministers responsible to the legislature. The provinces were given a separate legal status, specified subjects to operate according to the three-list system, and provided a federal relationship with the center. But the All India Federation did not materialize, and the powers given to the provinces became delegate authority under the devolution rules of the 1919 Act. Significantly, the Joint Parliamentary Committee report stated that each province will possess executive mechanism and legislature. It meant duality of power in ministers and the governor at the provincial level. The special powers of the governor and overriding legislative and executive functions of the Governor General show that the legal meaning to these phrases had significance in practice. The Governor General was the final authority in case of conflict between the center and provinces over the concurrent list. Many bills in the provincial legislature needed prior approval of the Governor General. The executive authority of the provincial government was restricted. The Governor General could give directions, issue instructions to the governor regarding the manner in which executive authority could be exercised in certain matters. Also, in all matters where the governor acted in his discretion or in his individual judgment, he was bound by the instructions of the Governor General. On the face of it, many of these provisions would be formal and natural in the context of the formation of a federal state from the otherwise unitary administration. Restrictions of similar nature have found place in our present constitution too. Center-state relations are more political than administrative, as it would have it. The 1935 Act put these powers in the executives who were politically not responsible to the elected legislature. Governor's power of acting in his discretion and in individual judgment to discharge his special responsibilities was very comprehensive. He had special powers with regard to police department and services besides the power of making ordinances. Further, the powers under Governor's Act were more drastic than the power of certification given to him under the 1919 Act. Here he could bypass the legislature. The legislatures were broad-based and elections direct, but the principle of communal representation was extended to promote new classes. Voting qualifications were minimum level of literacy and other monetary qualifications like payment of income tax, etc. The voters thus constituted hardly 27% of the adult population of British India. It was an advance over the 1919 Act, but it was too short of adult franchise, which would make democracy broad-based. The legislative and financial powers too were restricted because of the ordinary and extraordinary powers of the governor. The working of provincial autonomy. In the elections, Congress obtained clear majority in 6 provinces. In 3 provinces, Bengal, Assam and Northwest Frontier provinces, it was the single largest party. Only in the Punjab and Sindh, it could not come close to power. Congress victory in Northwest Frontier provinces was more significant, giving it the real national representative character. After receiving assurance from the Governor General that Governor will not interfere in the day-to-day administration and that he would reach his decisions with full understanding of the minister's arguments, Congress assumed power. The ministers were entrusted with large developmental activities and engaged in introducing social change. These covered primary education, prohibition, tenancy law, agricultural indebtedness, rural development, industrial wage disputes, cottage industries, and improvement of weaker sections of the society. But political issues created problems and made clear the reality of governor's overriding authority. For example, release of political detainees in UP and resignation of the Congress ministries in October 1939 on the issue of unilateral declaration by the British government of India's joining the World War II on the side of the Allies. The gains. Whatever the powers, the record of provincial ministers was satisfactory. It gave administrative expertise and Indian people proved worthy of it. It also proved that the Indian National Congress, while agitational in political programs, was equally a constructive force in Indian politics. The Act gave first taste and practice of parliamentary self-government and established good parliamentary conventions. The working of provincial autonomy thus furthered the cause of nationalism. The administrative structure. Organization of departments. In the reorganization of departments, natural grouping of subjects and administrative branches was the main consideration. The workload of the department also was a factor in reorganization. The whole administration was organized into 11 departments. Council of Agricultural Research was established in 1929. In 1937, the Foreign and Political Department was divided into 2 departments. Similarly, Department of Industries and Labor was bifurcated into 2 separate departments. In 1942, there was reorganization in 4 departments and also 3 separate departments of education, health and agriculture were established. However, departmental reshuffling was not always rational but influenced by economic considerations and the exigencies of war. In 1947, there were 19 departments: home, external affairs and commonwealth relations, finance, transport, railway, education, health, agriculture, food, industries and supplies, political, legislative works, mining and power, labor and information and broadcasting. Procedural changes aimed at reducing delay in administrative process. The Secretariat Procedure Committee 1919 advocated delegation of power, financial delegation, simultaneous circulation of papers to concerned levels, and informal communication between the member, secretary and deputy secretaries in a department. The Maxwell Committee 1937 looked into the minister-secretary relationship in the context of administrative continuity. Gorawala Committee 1951 looked up into the question of administrative integrity with Appleby Committee 1953 focused on training needs of officials, especially the middle level officials, and the need to establish organization and method department for continuous appraisal of administration structure and processes. The public service. The 1935 Act classified services as superior and other services. The Indian Civil Service, Indian Police and Indian Medical Civil Services were classified as superior services and controlled by the Secretary of State. These continued to enjoy special rights and privileges. No adverse order against a member of the superior service could be passed without concurrence of the governor. They had right to appeal to the Secretary of State against the adverse order. The 1919 Act had recommended for the establishment of the Federal Public Service Commission, and through it, Indianization of services was realized. The profile of service that developed was that of a generalist associated with the formulation of policies and their implementation. As a whole, public service retained an all India character. Administration of finance. The financial arguments under the Government of India Act 1935 were based on the recommendations of the Nymir Committee. Revenue sources followed the list system. As such, receipts from provincial subjects formed the main income source for provinces. Provinces were given some additional source of revenue too, for example, share in succession duty other than landed property, share in income tax, grant in aid, etc. The provinces were also given power to raise loans on the security of their resources. The center, to secure financial stability for itself, could for a period retain such sums as might be prescribed in the form of fixed percentage of income tax assigned to the provinces. The Auditor General of India occupied a key position in the financial administration. He controlled the accounts both of the center as well as the provinces. The Reserve Bank of India was established in April 1935. Financial control over expenditure was exercised through Public Account Committee of the Legislature. The centralized machinery of finance has been a feature of the Indian system since the Charter Act of 1833. The position of the office of the Comptroller and Auditor General in India, a statutory office in our present constitution, derives strength from this historic fact. Administration of Justice. The Government of India Act 1935 established the Federal Court to interpret the provisions of the Act and also to deal with inter-province conflicts. It is a prerequisite of a federal form of government. The Privy Council still continued as the highest court of the appeal for India. It indicates an easy compromise. The Federal Court made substantial contribution to the constitutional development of India. Much credit for this goes to Sir Morsi Goyer as the first Chief Justice in the formative period of its working. It established the cardinal principle of independence of judiciary in the critical period of its functioning. The immediate aim was to protect the autonomy of provinces and to emphasize order in the politically activated atmosphere. Local administration. Local government, being a transferred subject, received attention since the introduction of diarchy under the Act of 1919. All provisions enacted in this field made local governments more representative and popularly controlled. The legislation also provided for representation for backward and depressed classes and for labor classes. But as a local body were drawn in the nationwide political surge through civil disobedience movement, they lost the priority of attention. The traditional panchayat system had long been defunct, and the new local government could not take firm roots. The fact is that local government, rural or urban, grew as administrative necessity of managing local funds. Rippon's objective of political education was lost in executive directions that followed the resolution. Older village panchayat system was based on a corporate spirit, and British tenancy legislation affected this base. The British administration of justice was also centralized. The defunct panchayats therefore become a sink of localism and a den of narrow-mindedness. Ambedkar. The Decentralization Commission also looked at the problems from administrative angle. It was only with the experiment of community development movement and its subsequent development in Panchayati Raj that rural government structure become meaningfully involved in the larger process of participative development. Towards the new constitution, the deadlock. The Government of India Act 1935 was introduced in provinces. It was expected that the All India Federation would follow the provinces, would get a status of federal units, but the All India Federation did not materialize. The Governor General in Council exercised the executive authority on behalf of His Majesty. Even though the Federation did not come into existence, Federal Court, Federal Public Service Commission, and Federal Railway Authority started functioning. Unilateral decision on the part of British Government of India's participation in the Second World War on behalf of the Allies provoked Congress. It wanted the British government to declare that India would be free after the war. The government declared that it would undertake the review of 1935 Act immediately after consulting with various representatives of communities and princely states. Participation in the advisory consultative group suggested by the Governor General was felt inadequate as the Governor General could accept its advice at his will. Under these circumstances, Congress ministries under the resolution of Working Committee resigned from their offices in October 1939, creating a political deadlock. Declaration of constitutional breakdown by the governors was no solution to this situation. Therefore, the British government, in response to the Pune resolution of Congress Working Committee, July 1940, renewed its offer conceding some of the demands of the Congress. But the precondition that such a transfer needs the acceptance of minorities, in essence the Muslim League, made the offer ineffective. The 1935 Act thus became a lost ideal. Political developments were now quick, like individual Satyagraha 1940, inevitable failure of Cripps Mission 1942, the Quit India Movement 1942, the Cabinet Mission Plan 1946, and the Mountbatten Plan 1947, leading to partition and ultimate independence of the country. The process of change. Change is a discontinuous process. It is a development from earlier systems, taking something from these and at the same time rejecting the others. As it moves through interaction with old institutions, it shapes them, and while doing so, itself too undergoes a change. The outcome is a mix of the old and new together. The administration of Free India inevitably contains the impact and influence of the earlier experiments carried by the British governments. The legacy of British rule is therefore natural and obvious. The legacy of British rule. The Free India inherited governmental machinery as developed by the British. More than the machinery it received from the British rule, the feeling of importance attached to these institutions. The feeling of Raj, the importance of having a government, its necessity and accepting its strength. The traditional respect the Sarkar carried was as if possible on to the new government. The government is everywhere, one cannot escape it. There is an awareness of it, a sense of importance and acceptance that it needs to be strong and stable. The federal structure of government is also an important legacy. India is a federal state with important unitary features. The 1935 Act, which influenced its structure, was unitary with strong federal features. The British administration was district centered. It was headed by a generalist head with an overriding authority. The district head not merely represented government at the district level, he was in fact government at the district level. The district was subdivided into talukas consisting of villages and also grouped upward into firkas. This framework still continues. The All India services, especially the Indian Administrative Service and the Indian Police Service, strengthen integration. It gives an All India character to the governmental personnel and provides a steel frame to the administrative machinery. The structure of these services, they are built and shape their manner of functioning, inter-service and intra-service relations, and the ethos has influenced not only governmental functioning but governmental thinking too, not only of the government but also of the people at large. Constitutional experiments were enlarging and strengthening legislatures. Alongside legislative institutions, legislative culture also was spreading even though the national movement was becoming uncongenial. The Indian National Congress, under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, was becoming agitational, anti-governmental and extra-parliamentary. The essence of legislative culture is discussion and dialogue between different interests. Answerability of the executive and acceptance of responsibility in case of failure of its actions. This was accepted and necessary skills were developed as people took part in the working of councils. The legacy of judiciary, respect for the judicial structure, acceptance of its independence and regard for its values has also taken firm root in the soil. The boycott of courts was not as strong as the boycott of legislature. Many of the leaders in the early freedom struggle were from law profession who respected this tradition. The debates in the Constituent Assembly regarding judicial system also reflect this aspect. Considering various reforms leading to independence, it looks that the thread of British legacy runs through and reflects a degree of continuity in the process of change in latter years. Summary: The Montfort reforms give a responsive autocracy at the center and a truncated government at the provinces in the form of diarchy. Its failure was confirmed, and the Round Table conferences indicated the nature of the new constitutional reforms. The 1935 Act, as it was ultimately drafted, through these conferences, proposed an all India federation at the center and provincial autonomy at the provinces. The All India Federation could not be formulated as it needed acceptance by a requisite number of princely states before coming into force. Provisions regarding provincial governments were implemented. Provincial autonomy was a success in its operations as well as in bringing out its limitations. The Act of 1935 as a whole, however, was important. It not only acted as an interim constitution but also provided a basis for the Constitution of Free India. The Acts, along with earlier constitutional reforms, gave direction to the process of change as well as influenced its contents. It is this aspect which provided continuity in change. Chapter 4: